So the slicing for a resin printer is a little bit different from what we're normally having here. It's kind of the same sort of software that we normally use, but it's a little bit different. Now, one of the things when you get your D7 is that there's different software we can use. One of the more recommended and easier to use softwares right now is a piece of software called Creation Workshop. You can get it through this Wanhao support website, and it's just a simple download. So I've already got it open here for us. We'll jump right into it. Now, it's pre-configured for the Wanhao D7 Plus here. And in our case here, we have to make just a slight little change before we actually get into slicing. So under our Configure tab right here, we're going to go into the Configure Slicing's Profile tab. And for the D7 Plus, we just want to check the button here that says Export to CWS. So the CWS is kind of like the STL file format that we use for G-code file format that we use for other printers. The difference for this is being that with the original D7 and other printers where we didn't have the built-in screen, we'd normally have this connected directly to the PC. Exporting to CWS allows us to save the file to a USB key and load it up to the printer. So other than that, we just want to go under our Configure Machine option right here and ensure that we've got the Wanhao D7 listed as our machine. Now, all the other functions here are the machine profiles. We can adjust things such as the layer heights. So by default, it's a 50 micron build, which is about kind of the default quality. It's not the highest quality, but it's not the lowest quality, and it's a nice sort of average for the printing. We can also adjust different things such as our exposure time and our slice thicknesses here. So we'll see right here our first slice thickness in millimeters is 0.050. Our exposure time is 5,000 seconds, or 5,000 milliseconds, sorry. And our bottom exposure milliseconds is 30,000. So we can also adjust different things such as the bottom layers and so forth. A lot of this is just your default build, and it's a really good starting point for us when we're dealing with a resin print. So I'm going to go back into our 3D view here, and this is the actual stage of the printer itself. You can see it looks very similar to what Cura does, or other slicers in that model. So we have basically over here, we have all of our scene info where we can add additional scenes, object infos for when we actually load the objects themselves, and then different options for scaling, mirroring, and rotating the models we have. So in this case, I'm going to go up to the load menu right here, and we're going to click on the little file icon. And in this case, we're going to print a Marvin keychain. So I'm going to load up our normal model. It's very similar. It takes all the same kind of STLs and normal file formats that you can find and generate yourself. Very similar process. So now that we've loaded Marvin here onto our stage, and I'm just going to minimize some of our menus here, you can see that if I go into the Move menu here, I can move him around on the build stage. This is good if you want to add multiple items or reposition things accordingly. We can also rotate Marvins and other objects as well in 3 different axes here. Depending on what we're actually printing, if we're printing a ring or a smaller detailed item, we might actually want to rotate the position of the object so that it has a better first layer. It's very similar like we would with a traditional 3D printer where our first layer adhesion is critical. So we always want to ensure that we have a very nice, well-adhering first layer. Marvin's kind of nice in the sense that there's a pretty good first layer in his feet, and there's no real support structure needed for this because there's not too many huge overhangs, and it's a pretty small little print. If we did want to add support structures here, we can click on the plus icon here, and it brings up our support generation. And it's really neat because we can actually create different support shapes. Most common is what we call is a nail style support. So basically the nail style creates a larger base at the bed of the printer, and it narrows as it gets towards the actual print itself. That way the actual piece of support that's in contact with the print is extremely small and very easy to remove afterwards. And you can see it just shrinks it down right automatically for us. And again, if we wanted to mirror the print and so forth, we could do so. So really that's not too different from any other sort of slicing engine we'd use. All the same kind of controls are there. It works pretty much the same way, which is nice. So before we actually slice the print now, we have to save our changes here. So we'll just go up to the Save menu. And in this case, I'm going to save it to my desktop so we can get to it later. And I'm just going to call it 3D Marvin Wanhao i7 Plus. And we'll click Save. Now that we've saved the file, all we have to do here is click this little pie-shaped icon, the slice icon, and we'll click the slice button. Again, we have an option here of choosing what kind of slicing profile we want. 50 microns, 35 microns, or 100 microns. 50 microns is a good base model for us. And we'll click the slice button. It'll go through and slice all the layers for us, and even tell us how many layers we've got. This small model, which is going to be about 10 to 15 millimeters high, will be 382 layers. Very, very high detailed. So obviously with more complex models, your slicing time will take a little longer and stuff, but nothing too bad. And there we go. Now that we've actually sliced it, a really neat thing we can do is view all the sliced layers. So we'll go back to our slice tab right here. And this is a really cool view because this is actually what the LCD screen inside this printer will be showing. So we can actually take this little slider down here and drag it along and actually see each individual layer. And if you look carefully, you'll actually see it's the shape of the print itself. So the white light, or the white parts that we're seeing, is the actual UV exposed image that will be presented on the LCD screen there, and that's what actually cures the resin. Everything else remains black, and that's not what's cured. So everything looks good. Model seems to be pretty well intact, and everything looks quite nice. And from here, I'd say that's a good slice. So another thing to think about with resin printing is support structures, as well as if we're creating objects that are quite large, we got to think about hollowing them out. You don't want to necessarily create a really large model. Say for instance, if we were to scale this Marvin up, say 3-4 times, and then print it as a single model like that. That's a lot of resin we're going to use, and it's going to be a really long cure time. We might get some layer adhesion issues, and it's going to use up a lot of resin. So typically for larger models, you'll want to consider adding a small drainage hole to the foot of the Marvin or somewhere else on the object where you won't see it. That way, when it does print, it'll allow the excess resin to drain out of it. Now, of course, that will be something that you'll actually do in your modeling software if you're creating models. A lot of commercial models too have provisions for that too. So, but if you are creating your own models and you want to not use up an entire tank of resin on one print, it's something that you might want to consider. You can also take a solid model like this. If we took the raw version of the Marvin and took it into our CAD program, we could hollow it out and basically create the entire exterior shell as just a 1 millimeter thick or a 0.5 millimeter thick outside wall, and then the inside of it is completely empty. And that would be a much easier way of printing it as well. Some things to consider when printing with resin printers. They're not all that different in terms of the operation and setup from a traditional printer, but there's little things. And obviously the best way to play with these and learn more about them is to just experience and play with different models and learn from your failures, learn from your mistakes, and go from there. So with our file actually saved like so, all we have to do now is just go back to our desktop, take our new file that we've saved, copy it to our USB key, and put it in the printer and click print. Welcome back. So before we begin, a word about safety. Resin printers can be toxic. The resin in them is relatively toxic for our health. It has a lot of different chemicals in it. So when we're working with these machines, we like to wear some kind of eye protection and absolutely glove protection. We don't want to get this stuff on our skin and any other areas as well. The longer we're exposed to it, the more toxins we have. But as long as we treat it carefully and we have the right precautions, we're perfectly fine. So let's get started first. The Duplicator 7 is a LCD-based SLA printer. That means unlike traditional printers where we use rolls of filament, this is basically using a UV curable resin to print the objects in it. The advantage of UV resin is that we get very, very fine detail in the models. So we can print very high detailed small items with it. So when we're starting with our first print here, we'll take our lid off. And it exposes our actual assembly here. It's a lot more simple than a traditional 3D printer that you might see, like a Wanhao i3 Plus or other systems. All we really have here is our Z stage, our actual resin vat where the resin pours into it, and then the actual underneath the resin vat here, our LCD screen which cures the models. So before we begin, that's a basic overview of what we need. So our first steps when we begin with one of these printers is making sure that all of our build surfaces are clean. This involves the actual vat right here. If we remove these two thumb screws that hold the vat down, and we take these off just like so, we can remove the vat right here. And the one thing we want to ensure is that the film on the bottom side of this vat is nice and clean. If you've done multiple prints before, you'll want to take a paper towel with some IPA alcohol, and this is one of the most important stuff we'll use on this entire print, and just gently wipe down the film to avoid scratching it, but also clean off any excess residue or any dirt that might be there. Lint as well is a common factor that will get onto these screens and damage them as well. So we've already pre-cleaned this. We know it's relatively clean. We'll be carefully inserting it back onto the posts right here, and we'll put the screws back in place. These thumb wheels, we want to be careful when we're tightening these down. There's an LCD screen underneath the base of this assembly, and we don't want to tighten it down too tight. If we tighten it down too tight, we might actually damage the LCD. What we want to do basically is tighten it down just snug enough that that's not going to move around or move potentially up when the print is happening. Our second assembly right here is our actual build platform. We just release this giant knob right here, and our entire platform comes off. You can see it's just a milled piece of aluminum, very smooth, very flat. And we'll just want to take our paper towel, I'll put this right here for a minute, and a little bit of IPA alcohol here. So typically with most stores you can get 70 to 90% IPA alcohol. Obviously the higher concentration the better. It's a little bit more stronger, as you would put it, and it helps clean the surfaces just a little bit better. So put a little bit of dab on our paper towel and just wipe it down and clean it off here. Just getting any excess residue or dirt that might be present on the actual build surface. So just like so. So once we reinsert this back into the assembly right here, square it up to the frame and then just tighten down this knob. Perfect. At this stage, we're ready to power up the printer. Everything else looks in good shape, everything's nice and clean, so we'll power it up here. It'll take a couple seconds to boot up. One of the advantages of the Plus is that it actually has a nice built-in LCD interface. So there's no need to actually attach this to a computer or have any other software running with it. Very nice and easy. So the big thing with a resin printer is ensuring that this build platform is level to the vat itself. So on the side of the units here, right on the build stage, we got these two screws. There's 4 of them all the way around. We just want to loosen these off completely. And you'll see that as I loosen them off, the Z stage will drop down. And you want to keep it loose enough, not loose enough that it'll fall off, but loose enough that we can wiggle it around, move it around like that. So once we've done that, we'll go into our utilities and we will hit the level function and click next on the screen. And this will lower the Z-axis down into the vat itself. Nice thing about these printers is they're quite quiet. They're very compact, very small, and they generally don't have a lot of the noise that larger printers have. So you see it's just going down into the vat right here. You'll actually see that eventually this build plate will bottom out and that the Z stage will continue to move down a little bit. Just like so. Okay, and it's just homing itself. So what I like to do now is I like to put both my fingers on opposite sides of the build platform like so. And then I like to just gently press down, not too hard, because again I want to be careful of the LCD screen. But then I'll just start tightening up one of the screws. And I usually like to work from the back, so I'll do the back left right here, and then I'll alternate to the front right, opposite here. Just keeping a gentle pressure on the platform to ensure that it's staying nice and flush with the build plate. So again, I'll come around to this side here, tighten these down. And you don't want to tighten them down too much, but you do want to ensure that they're tight enough that the build plate's not going to move around or drop unexpectedly while printing. And I'll just do the back corner here. Just like so. Double check to make sure everything is nice and tight. And we are good. Perfect. Okay. So now that we've leveled our bed assembly to the resin or to the vat itself, that's really all we really need to truly do for calibration. It's a lot simpler process than leveling your bed and extruding your filaments and so forth. So we'll just go back into our OK menu here. And I'll go to my Z height here, and I will just raise this up a little bit. I'm doing 1.1. There we go. And all we want to do here is just raise our bed up enough that we'll be able to add our resin to the print. There we go. Okay? So at this point, I'm going to take our USB key. Our USB key right here already has our file loaded onto it. I'm just going to plug it into the back of the unit. There's only a single USB port on the back and just a power switch. There's not much to these units. With the USB, there's always 3 different ways to plug it in. Helps when you can see what you're doing. Okay, with that all in there, we'll do one final check to make sure everything looks nice and clean. Platform looks good. Our build platform looks good. I'm just going to raise this up a little bit more, like so. I'm going to take our resin. It's important to always keep some paper towels, keep your glove on at all time. Be careful when we're pouring into this. Our print's really small, so we really don't need a lot of resin in this vat. In fact, for some of the large prints on here, you don't need to ever go more than about a quarter full of this vat. We don't need to fill it up right to the edge, because as this build plate submerges down into the vat, it will displace the resin, and we don't want it overflowing and getting on to all the other components on the bed itself. So we're just going to carefully, I'm going to put the paper towel underneath, pour in just a little bit of resin. That should be more than enough for our print here. Be careful that we don't get anything anywhere else. The thing with this resin is because it's UV curable, if we get it on any surfaces such as the table and so forth, you want to take a clean cloth and a little bit of IPA and rub it down and clean it down that way. If we just tend to wipe it off without, with a dry cloth, we could leave a little bit of residue behind. It ends up getting sticky and it leaves a little bit of a mess. So we've got that in place right now. Everything looks good. Resin looks great. We're just going to go back to our menu right here and click the big home button. And this is just going to lower that Z stage right back down into the vat again, and then we'll be ready to print. So now that our Z stage is homed and you can see the resin's flowing all around it, I'm just going to click the back button here and click back once more to our main menu. Go to our print option, it's a nice simple menu, and click on the plus icon down here. And there is our file right there. Before I actually start the print, I'm going to put the cover back in place. This is UV curable resin, so we don't want to expose it to sunlight or any UV sources, as it will actually cause the resin to prematurely cure. And we will select our file, hit the check mark again, and then hit our play button. And that's as easy as it is to start a resin print. At this point, the printer's going to go through, start doing all the layers, and hopefully in about an hour or so, we'll have a nice completed print. So now that our print's finished, it's time to remove it and see how it turned out. So just going to remove the lid here nice and carefully. And on first look, it looks like we've got a Marvin. So we want to be careful here again with all the resin here. This is all coated in resin. So obviously wear your gloves and make sure you're careful with things. So all I'm going to do here is just undo the knob, loosen this off, and very carefully just tilt this back and let any excess resin come off of the build plate. You take your included scraper with the printer and then just kind of squeegee any of the resin on the build plate back into the vat. Okay. Just like so. Nice stuff about this is it can be reused afterwards, so long as it's not contaminated or partially cured. So we can actually pour this back into the vat when we're done with it and reuse it again. And so long as the printer is with the lid on it and stored in a cool, dry, dark place, the resin will not actually cure in the printer. As long as we keep it out of UV light, we're pretty good. So we'll do that right there. Put this down for a second. Now, what I've prepared right here is a small container full of the IPA alcohol as before. And we basically want to rinse all the resin that's on the print itself, because there's still a little bit of uncured resin on it. So I'm just going to very carefully pull this over here, tilt my bed plate here, and take our little prior and hopefully, if we can, pop it right off. Okay, so we should be able to just slide this right off the build plate, and there we go. Okay, so I'm just going to put this aside. Remember, you want to keep the resin as best as you can in the printer itself and not all over your workspace. So just button that back up there. And then I'm just gonna put the lid back on this container, and you just wanna give it a gentle swish around just to get some of the excess resin off. Like so. And you can actually leave it sit for a few minutes if you really want, and let it soak a little bit more as well. Okay. There we go. There we go. Created a little bit of a mess, but it's not that bad. And if we're lucky here, be able to pull out our resin print. And I'm going to move this off to the side, and we'll just dry this off a bit. So it's not fully cured at this point, and what you'll want to do is actually leave your part out in a window with some sunlight for 10 to 15 minutes and let it cure. That will cause the resin to fully cure, and at that point then we'll have a perfectly finished model. If you find there's still a little bit of residue on the model itself or still a little sticky, you can put it back into the IPA and let it cure and rinse off a little bit more, and just put it a little bit into the light again, and you should be good. And that's really all there is to your first resin print. So there you go, our first print on the Wanhao Duplicator 7 Plus.